Okay, so in the last video we discussed an overview of how we're going to set up those 3 spine controls. In this video I'd like to begin the implementation of those spine controls so at least they are interpolating based on the position of the hips and the shoulders, even though they're not going to be interpolating in terms of the rotation of the shoulders compared to the hips. So let's jump over into Houdini. And I'm going to start out by creating the actual animator controls that are going to affect these control objects. So currently we have the 3 controls that are driving our CV locations, and as discussed on the whiteboard, these aren't going to be the final animator controls. These are going to be controls that we are going to drive through other systems that are then going to be used to drive our curve. So let's hunt down those 3 control objects. And let's go ahead and actually move these up towards where we're working with our spine. So I'm going to grab all 3 of these and move these up towards our spine. Probably right around here will make most sense. And we know that control 1 is towards the lower end of our spine. Control 2 is higher up, and control 3 higher up than that. So if we set these so that they are oriented in a more logical manner, that would make a lot more sense. So what I'm going to do, I want to create the control objects that are offset towards the back of our character, and to do that I'm going to start out by wiring a null as a child of our existing controls and then offsetting each of those nulls a certain amount back in Z. I'm going to offset them all the same amount so that the relationship that we've seen between our controls out behind our character represents the relationship of the CV controls where they're actually being used to drive our spine. So I'm going to first wire off nulls and translate those back, but then I'm going to unparent them to keep their position and actually parent our spine curve controls underneath those nulls. So these are going to be the children, and the controls that we create are going to be eventually the parent. So I'm going to wire a null off of our first control, and I'm going to call this spine control underscore 1. So this is going to be our first spine control. And let's translate this back in Z, and to see how far to translate this, let's take a look at our goblin character. So I want this to be quite far behind our goblin character, so I may even push that further back. Let's say I'm going to translate this back a -3. We can hide out our goblin now. So we have our spine control 1 translated back a -3. If I keep position when parenting, unparent from that control object, that will give us its position in space, in world space. We can then turn around and parent our control up underneath that control object, and that means now if we came in and modified that control, we are going to be modifying our CV by the spine curve control 1, but we're offset from that location. So instead of having to work with something buried inside our character geometry, we are indeed offset from that location. So we can go ahead, grab our spine curve control 1, turn off visibility, selectability, and delete its node color out. Then we can go ahead with spine control 1, the animator controlled spine control 1, give it a blue node color since that is a control object. Go ahead and give it a yellow wireframe color since indeed we are creating a central control. And I'm going to give this a control type of null and circles. I will leave that with a geoscale of 1. And you'll see that that gives us a nice control type for dealing with our spine. So I'm going to repeat this process now for the other 2 controls. So let's wire a null off of spine curve control 2. I want to translate this back the same amount as our earlier curve. So that's a -3 that we used earlier. So I'm going to use that now, and we can go ahead and unparent this while keeping position. Also want to rename this to spine curve, rather spine control underscore 2, and then parent spine control to the original control underneath our newly created animator control. Turn off the node color for that node, the visibility, selectability of that node. Go ahead and give our newly created spine control a blue node color, yellow wireframe, and null and circles as the control type. Let's start rearranging this network just to give ourselves a little bit of space. So I'm going to start pulling off these controls that we are controlling over on the actual curve off to the side, and then we're going to have our spine controls off towards the left. So let's do this one last time. I'm going to create a final null for the control itself. I'm going to rename this to spine control underscore 3. Again, I want this to translate back a -3 in Z. I want to keep position and unparent. Just give Houdini a second to think about that. We're then going to reparent the original control to the newly created control, keeping position. Go ahead and turn off its visibility, selectability, and node color. Then create a blue node color for this guy since he's a control object. Yellow wireframe color. And also give him a null and circles. Now I'm not going to worry about zeroing out transformations just yet, although I will zero out that slight rotation since that isn't needed. But I won't worry about zeroing out the translations into the pre-transform because these are now going to be parented to those spacer nulls, those nulls that are going to linearly interpolate in terms of position between the shoulder controls and our hip controls. So they're going to be parented underneath those. Once they're parented in, then I'll deal with cleaning up their transforms. So I'm actually going to have those spacer nulls parented to our hips, and that's so they inherit the orientation of our hips. So I'm going to branch off of our hip control into a new null, and I'm going to name this null spine control underscore 1 underscore spacer. Now to interpolate between the two positions of our hips to the shoulders, I can use the origin expression to work out the relative position of the shoulders from our hips, and then I can go ahead and take that and divide that by, in this case, 4 to give me 1/4, or by 2 to give me halfway for the second spacer, or I can multiply it by 3 and divide it by 4 to give me 3/4 of the way for the third spacer. So I'm actually going to take the origin from relative to our hip control, and I'm going to reference, in this case I'm going to reference spine control 5, so that we're actually offsetting up towards that the highest CV on our spine. And we know that spine control 5 is parented underneath our shoulders, so when we move our shoulders, spine control 5 will be moving as well. So let's take that spacer. I'm going to bring up the expression editor and it's translate X. Let's use an origin expression. This is relative to the hip control, and I want to grab the position of our spine curve underscore control underscore 5. Again, that is the topmost control. In this case, I'm interested in translate X, and I want to divide this by 4 because I want 1/4 of that position. We can go ahead, I can copy this. Let's paste that in and find out translate in Y, and paste this in and find out translate in Z. So I paste that into our translate Y, our translate Z, and change the components I was after, and you'll see that we have interpolated 1/4 of the way up from the hip position up over to the position of that spine control 5. So I'm going to control C, control V to duplicate this and create a spine control 2 spacer. And in this case, I want the exact same expression, but instead of divided by 4, I want to divide by 2. I want half of that expression. So I'm going to repeat that for Y and for Z as well. And you can see now we are divided by 2, so we're halfway between our hips and that topmost control. I'm going to control C the original control. Since I want to have 3/4, we're already dividing by 4 here. If I multiply that by 3, that will give me 3/4. So control C our original control, control V to paste that, give ourselves our spine control underscore 3 underscore spacer, and let's take that expression and multiply that expression by 3. So we have 3 times the expression divided by 4. That will give us 3/4. If I do that for Y and for Z as well, you'll see that now we are 3/4 of the way. So we have these 3 nulls that are linearly interpolating. If we grab our shoulders, you'll see they are indeed linearly interpolating between the positions of our hips and effectively our shoulders. Now that we have those in place, they can become the parents of our 3 spine controls. So let's move these to their respective locations in the network. I'll turn off their visibility and selectability. And then let's go ahead and parent our spine control underneath that, making sure, of course, we do have keep position when parenting. So I'll parent spine control 3 to spacer 3. spine control 2 to spacer 2, and spine control 1 to spacer 1. We've kept position when parenting, but now that we have all of this parenting in place, we know these are the rest positions for these particular controls. So let's go ahead, and this is a very slight rotation, so I will just manually zero that out, then clean add transforms on this node, and then clean add transforms on that node as well. So all three controls now have their rest locations as specified with 0, 0, 0 in the translates. So we can still come in and move these controls from that point. We still have the ability to tweak our spine with those controls. But now we can come in, and these controls are going to linearly interpolate between our spine, or rather between our hips and our shoulders. So that means as we start moving our shoulders out, they're going to expand. As I just wait for Houdini to think for a second. There we go. So they're going to expand, which is fantastic because that now means that I can set up something, for example, let's move that back down to its default pose. Let's say I set up something really extreme on the spine. I set up a shape that looks something kind of like this. So for whatever reason, that is the shape I want on my spine. Now as I move my shoulders up, as demonstrated on the whiteboard, we maintain that relationship. It's got stretched out in Y, but we've maintained that shape relationship, and that's a really nice feature of the way that we're linear interpolating, but then underneath that we then have manual control. So I'm going to zero these back out to their default locations. We can also take a look at the fact that, say we've got our attach control and that's over there, we know that we're referencing, rather than a control in particular, we were referencing that fifth CV control that is attached to the result of the blending. When we blend, you can see that indeed our spine controls as well are blending, giving us a nice smooth blend on the spine as a whole between those two locations. So with that in place, let's zero out that control. Now we do still have some more features that we need to add into those spine controls, but before we do that, we need to actually apply that feature to the bones first, and that is the fact that when we rotate the shoulder control, we currently don't twist our bones. When we do twist our bones, I want for these controls to also rotate round so that we maintain more of the spine shape as we rotate around. Also, when we rotate around in X currently, you'll notice that those controls aren't really pulling up and over, and I really want it to sort of feel like if you rotate over in X, you're hunching your back up over, so I wanted that control to move up and over. Now it is worth pointing out there, I did select that with the rotate tool, and notice that we haven't yet locked our parameters, so let's go ahead and lock everything except for translates on those nodes. Fantastic. Now going back to talking about the twist and talking about that other rotation, the rotation in X, this is something that we will be dealing with in a couple of videos time. Right now this is all I wanted to set up in this video, so that is actually going to conclude this video. Thanks a lot everyone.